Rome's hunger for power was unquenchable, its thirst for luxury unending, and so it delved deeper into the Mediterranean's riches, plucking out not just gold or grain, but people. It created a demand for the rarest commodity, the most exquisite human specimen. The obsession was not with utility or labor, but with aesthetics, with molding young bodies and minds into the perfect ornament. These were the prized possessions of the Roman elite, bought not for their strength or skills, but for their beauty, their elegance, their appearance. They were seen as living pieces of art, as objects of luxury, as the ultimate status symbol. In the grand halls of Roman palaces, amidst the finest marble and gold, they moved like prized possessions, carefully displayed, always watched, never free. Amongst the many lives entangled in Rome's vast net, this group remains the most unsettling. These were not just enslaved people, they were symbols of wealth, walking embodiments of power, and they were bought and sold like the finest wines or silks. No, not like the finest wines or silks, for these were living, breathing human beings. Their day began and ended with grooming, with shaping their bodies and minds to fit the image of perfection that their owners sought. They were trained to carry scrolls, to pour wine, to play music, to recite poetry, to be the perfect backdrop to their owner's glory. They were not allowed to speak unless spoken to move unless commanded, to feel, to think, to dream. They were to be seen, not heard. And if any one of them dared to dream of freedom, they were crushed like a fragile statue, too valuable to be broken, yet beyond repair. In the eyes of Roman law, they were property, nothing more than furniture or livestock, except that they could speak, obey, and be trained. The most prized possessions of the emperors were the most tragic, for in the emperor's domain, ownership was never enough. What was demanded there was absolute control. The emperor's household became their prison, the center of the world their gilded cage. To be in the emperor's household was to be in the belly of the beast, to be at the heart of power, yes, but to have no power oneself. It was to be surrounded by luxury while living in its shadow. It was to be at the center of the world's attention while remaining unseen. Here under the watchful eyes of the empire's most powerful men, their bodies were molded, their minds broken, their spirits crushed until there was nothing left of them but a hollow echo of a human being, a mere ornament to adorn the palaces of the mighty. You can tell a lot about a civilization by the things it chooses to display. Inside the Roman imperial palace, power was on full display. It was in the architecture, the artwork, and yes, even in the people. There was a group of men who stood out, not because they were stronger or more important, but because of their absence of something, their lack of certain body parts. They were eunuchs, men whose bodies had been altered to remove their sex drive. Now, the Romans loved two things, power and theatrics, and these men were the perfect props in their game of domination. You see, these eunuchs weren't just any slaves. They were carefully selected boys, often from far-off lands, brought to Rome to serve in the emperor's household. They were symbols of wealth and power. Having a eunuch wasn't just about having a servant, it was about showing the world that you were in the emperor's inner circle. But let's be real here. It wasn't all sunshine and roses for these guys. Living in the imperial palace was like being in a fish tank. Every action, every gesture was watched, every word was measured. They weren't allowed to be anyone but what the emperor wanted them to be, and if they weren't careful, they could be replaced in a heartbeat. The Romans weren't stupid. They knew what they were doing. By displaying these men in their courts, they were sending a message to everyone around them. They were saying, look how powerful we are, we have the emperor's ear and he trusts us. It was a way to climb the social ladder, to become part of the elite. But don't get it twisted. This wasn't just a harmless game. This was about control, complete and utter control. By removing these men's ability to procreate, they became less than human in the eyes of the Romans. They were mere possessions, objects to be used and displayed. It's a sad reality, but that was the world they lived in. They were silenced, their stories lost to time. All we have are the stories the Romans chose to tell, the stories that glorified their cruelty. So next time you think about ancient Rome, remember the eunuchs, the men without shadows, who walked the streets of Rome, the men who were more than slaves, but less than free. Their story is a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the greatest of empires. Life as a youth inside Rome's imperial palaces might seem like the ultimate paradox. On the one hand, it meant living in golden halls, rubbing shoulders with emperors and having a front row seat to the machinations of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. On the other hand, it meant existing at the whim of masters who could make or break your life with a single gesture. It meant being both hyper-visible and completely silenced, part of the spectacle of Roman power while being denied any of its rewards. We see this most clearly in the life of Sporus, an enslaved youth who became the obsession of Emperor Nero. Ancient sources tell us that Nero changed his name, made him wear the finest clothes, and paraded him around in public. He even introduced Sporus to the public by having him ride on a chariot with him at the famous chariot races. To the outside world, this display must have seemed shocking, even scandalous. But in the palace, it was just another demonstration of Roman power over human lives. But Sporus wasn't the only one. There were others too, like Pythagoras, who served in the household of Emperor Hadrian. His story is told with delicacy in the writings of Marguerite Yourcenar, where he appears as a cultured and refined young man. But even in this version, there's an undercurrent of uneasiness about his situation. Pythagoras' story serves as a reminder that the greatest works of art can still emerge from the darkest of times, and that even in the most rigid of hierarchical structures, individuality can find a way to assert itself. There were also others whose stories were remembered not because they were exceptional, but because they were considered problematic. One such person was a young man named Paris, who was part of the entourage of the notorious Emperor Tiberius. According to the historian Tacitus, Paris attracted unwanted attention for his beauty, and when one of Tiberius's freedmen made a suggestive remark to him, Paris responded by throwing acid in the man's face. This act of defiance was seen as scandalous, and Paris was punished. His story is a reminder that even within the imperial court, where power and excess were celebrated, there were limits to what was considered acceptable. These stories might seem like mere gossip, the kind of salacious tales that we might normally ignore, but they are much more than that. They are glimpses into a world that we normally don't get to see. The inner sanctum of Roman power, where men with the authority to shape the destinies of nations could also indulge their basest desires. They are also a reminder of the human cost of that power. The men we meet in these stories were not just objects of ridicule or disgust, but real people with hopes, fears, and dreams. They were as trapped by the constraints of their time and place as we are by ours. This is the host. This is the Vox. And if you want to hear more about ancient Rome, stay tuned. The tragedy of these lives lies not only in their silence, but in how thoroughly they were woven into the spectacle of Roman grandeur. Their identities became instruments of display, their roles shaped to reflect the wealth and status of those who owned them. They were never remembered for themselves, only for how they served as symbols. Roman society, obsessed with appearances, used these enslaved youths as living ornaments. They might be taught music, poetry, or refined manners, not for their own growth, but to enhance the prestige of their masters. Their elegance became an extension of elite image, a way to impress guests and rivals. To sit quietly in the background, adorned in fine clothing, was itself a performance that reflected the household's refinement. Yet beneath this polished exterior was a life of constant control. Every gesture was monitored, every word shaped by discipline. Their surroundings may have been filled with marble floors and painted ceilings, but those walls confined rather than liberated. Their value was measured not by who they were, but by how well they could embody an image crafted for them. This paradox did not disturb the Roman elite. In fact, they embraced it. To them, possession of such youths was a mark of cultural superiority, a visible demonstration of refinement. The empire prided itself on law and order, yet tolerated systems that undermined the very idea of human dignity. This contradiction was not hidden, it was institutionalized. Even Roman writers who criticized excess, like Juvenal or Martial, rarely questioned the system itself. They mocked the indulgence of the wealthy, but accepted the presence of enslaved children as part of everyday life. Their sharp words targeted extravagance, not injustice. For Rome, the problem was never the system, it was only the extremes of how it was displayed. Inside the imperial court, this contradiction deepened. Enslaved boys were both invisible and indispensable. They moved silently among senators, poets, and emperors, maintaining appearances while never being seen as individuals. They lived in the most visible spaces of the empire, yet their identities were erased. Their lives were testimonies not of freedom, but of how thoroughly power could reshape human existence. The accounts of figures like Sporus or the rumors around Tiberius as Villa are not just stories of excess. They are reflections of the empire's character. They reveal how power could reach into the smallest corners of life, transforming people into instruments of spectacle. Even in the midst of glory, there was always an undercurrent of control. And still, these youths remain largely absent from history. Their stories are fragmented, filtered through the pens of satirists or historians who often had their own agendas. What remains is a shadow, a faint trace of lives lived in proximity to unimaginable power, yet stripped of agency. To consider their existence is to confront the hidden cost of Rome's grandeur. Every triumphal arch, every marble forum, every golden hall was mirrored by lives that were silenced to make it possible. Rome's greatness shone brightly, but its shadows were just as vast. To look at Rome's grandeur is to see only part of the story. The arches, temples, and monuments remain testaments to the empire's vision of itself. But behind those stones were lives that made such splendor possible, lives that history rarely allows us to see clearly. The enslaved boys of the imperial household stand as one of the most haunting examples of this truth. Their existence was shaped entirely by forces beyond their control. They were taken from families, lands, and identities, absorbed into a system that valued them not as individuals, but as reflections of status. In the households of the elite, their presence reinforced the idea that luxury and refinement required not just wealth, but ownership of human lives. In the palace of the emperor, their roles became even more symbolic, expressions of absolute power molded into living displays that served no purpose beyond reinforcing authority. What makes their story especially tragic is the paradox of proximity. They lived near the very heart of power, closer to emperors than most citizens could ever dream. Yet this closeness brought no freedom, no influence, no legacy. They could sit beside rulers at public events, sleep in rooms lined with golden couches, and dress in garments finer than those of ordinary Romans. But their lives were not their own. Their identities were erased in the service of spectacle. Rome's greatness dazzled the world, but it also concealed lives lived under unrelenting control. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson beneath every triumphal arch and golden hall. There are voices unheard, lives unseen, and stories waiting to be remembered. The empire often prided itself on law, justice, and rational order. But the stories of these youths reveal the fractures beneath that image. Rome's laws might declare certain practices forbidden, yet in practice, the will of the powerful reshaped reality. Official prohibitions meant little when emperors and nobles chose to ignore them. In this way, the very core of Roman order was built on contradictions, its ideals undermined by its own luxuries. Writers like Juvenal asked, "Who will guard the guards themselves?" The question captures the essence of the empire's hidden cruelty. When those at the top could command absolute control, who was left to question their actions? The enslaved had no voice, and the elite had little reason to confront their own contradictions. The system persisted because it was convenient, profitable, and deeply rooted in the culture of power. To remember these forgotten lives is not simply to revisit a dark chapter of history. It is to recognize the hidden costs of empire, the ways in which power consumes the vulnerable to maintain its image of greatness. The silence of these boys is a silence imposed by history itself, a silence that reminds us that even the most celebrated civilizations are built on shadows. Their stories may be fragmented, but their existence forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that refinement and cruelty often walked hand in hand.